Rural Vermont, October 1972. 6 months after her husband's sudden death, Margaret Ellis shocked her farming community by doing something that made absolutely no sense. While her neighbors were buttoning up for what the Farmer's Almanac predicted would be a brutal winter, this 52-year-old widow was building a massive barn structure completely around her house. Not beside it, not behind it. A complete wooden shell that would encase her entire two-story farmhouse within a sheltering gap of protected space. When asked why, Margaret simply smiled. That same quiet smile that had frustrated the town busybodies since Arthur's funeral, and continued measuring, sawing, and hammering alongside the young carpenter she'd hired from Burlington. The ridicule started immediately. At the general store, farmers shook their heads. At church socials, women whispered. Even the teenagers cruising Main Street in their parents' pickup trucks laughed at the crazy widow lady building a house around her house. Griefs made her simple, they said. Hippie ideas from that artist daughter of hers. Waste of good insurance money. But Margaret hadn't lost her mind. She discovered something that would slash her heating costs by 60%, keep her firewood dry all winter, and revolutionize how rural families approached home energy in an era of oil embargoes and skyrocketing fuel prices. What did this former schoolteacher understand about heat loss, moisture control, and Yankee ingenuity that her farming neighbors had missed? Before I reveal the simple engineering principle that saved Margaret from freezing and transformed rural building practices across New England, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because what Margaret built wasn't foolish. It was decades ahead of its time. The tarp came off with a wet slap, and Margaret Ellis knew immediately that she was in trouble. Early October 1972, the firewood pile Arthur had stacked the previous spring looked nothing like seasoned cordwood. White rot spotted the oak splits like a disease. She pressed her thumb against one piece. It sank into the wood with disturbing ease, soft and spongy. Useless. Nearly 3 cords of firewood compromised by moisture that had seeped through the tarp all summer. Margaret pulled off her gardening gloves and stood in the October chill, breath fogging. Arthur had stored firewood this way for 30 years, stacked against the barn, covered with canvas weighted down with rocks. "This is how my father did it," he'd said 100 times. "This is how I do it." But Arthur wasn't here anymore, and his father's method wasn't going to keep her warm. Inside, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the heating oil bill from last March. Oil prices had jumped 17 cents a gallon since spring. At current rates, keeping the drafty farmhouse livable through winter would cost close to $800. She had Arthur's life insurance. $8,000 that felt like both a fortune and nowhere near enough. $800 represented 10% of everything she had. The Farmer's Almanac predicted a brutal winter. She'd called Harrison's Fuel and Lumber that afternoon, hoping to buy seasoned cordwood to replace what had rotted. Dale Harrison had been apologetic but firm. "Mrs. Ellis, I've got nothing to sell you." Wet autumn meant nobody could cure wood properly. What little seasoned stock exists is already spoken for. A pause. "If I were you, I'd budget heavy on the oil furnace this year." Budget heavy. With what money? Margaret sat on the back porch that evening, overwhelmed by the weight of decisions she'd never had to make alone. In her lap, she held Arthur's work gloves, leather worn soft by decades of use, smelling faintly of Old Spice aftershave and sawdust. She let herself cry for a moment, because some days the grief still ambushed her in the smallest objects. But then her eyes caught the magazine on the porch table. Rebecca's copy of Mother Earth News, left behind during her last visit. The cover promised articles about energy independence and homestead heating solutions. Margaret had dismissed it as hippie nonsense when Rebecca first brought it. Now, with her ruined firewood pile and an impossible heating bill looming, she picked it up and started reading. There was an article, "Protected Firewood Storage and Thermal Shells. What Scandinavian Builders Know That You Don't." Diagrams showed enclosed storage spaces, ventilated structures that kept wood dry while allowing air circulation. The science teacher in her, dormant for 2 years since retirement, suddenly woke up. Heat transfer, moisture content, BTU efficiency. Arthur would want me to survive, she thought, turning pages in the fading light. Even if that means doing things differently. By the time darkness fell, Margaret Ellis had made a decision that would change everything. Jack Morrison arrived in a faded blue VW bus with a Whole Earth catalog bumper sticker and hair that touched his shoulders. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her optimism deflating. This was the carpenter? He looked like he should be selling macrame at a craft fair, not building anything structural. But he was the only one who'd returned her calls. 3 contractors had politely declined once she explained her idea. Jack Morrison had said, "When can I come see the site?" Now he stood in her yard, 25 with work boots that had seen work, studying her farmhouse with surprising intensity. She brought out the Mother Earth news article, already defensive. Jack's face lit up. "This is brilliant. Passive solar envelope combined with Danish wood storage techniques." He pulled a pencil from behind his ear, sketching on the back. "We build the outer shell 4 feet from your walls. Protected storage plus thermal buffer. Ventilate top and bottom so air circulates but weather can't penetrate. Roof overhang extends 3 feet to shed precipitation." Margaret stared. Someone understood. Someone took her seriously. "I studied environmental design at UVM," Jack explained, still sketching. "Dropped out senior year because I wanted to build things, not just draw them. My father owns Morrison Construction in Burlington, big commercial stuff, strip malls and office parks. He thinks I'm wasting my potential building hippie nonsense." He grinned. "But this is smart building. This is how we should have been doing things all along." He did calculations on her article margins, measuring tape snapping as he moved around the property. Finally, he sat down at her porch table and wrote out a quote. "Materials and labor, $2,800. I can start next week if you approve the design." $2,800. More than a third of her insurance money. Margaret's hand hovered over the paper, suddenly aware of the enormity of what she was considering. Harold Pritchard's truck rumbled up the driveway before she could respond. He climbed out with that proprietary air he'd adopted since Arthur's death, as if widows were community property requiring management. "Margaret, honey," he said, not even acknowledging Jack. "I heard you were meeting with contractors. Before you make any rash decisions, let the men handle this. Sell the place to someone who can maintain it properly. Arthur wouldn't want you struggling." The fury that rose in Margaret's chest was white-hot, but years of being a proper schoolteacher kept her voice level. "Thank you, Harold. I'll consider that." Harold nodded, satisfied, and drove away. Jack waited until the truck disappeared. "Please don't consider that." Margaret looked at this shaggy-haired kid who read Buckminster Fuller and understood thermal envelopes, who'd rejected his father's construction empire to build things that made sense. Her hand was shaking as she picked up the pen. "When can you start?" she asked and signed the check. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked through the farmhouse in darkness, trailing her fingers along walls she and Arthur had painted together, woodwork he'd refinished, floors they'd walked for 29 years. In the bedroom, his flannel shirts still hung in the closet. In the study, his reading glasses sat on the desk beside a book he'd never finish. Was she honoring his memory by staying here, or destroying it by changing everything? The doubt was suffocating. But the check was written, and Jack Morrison would arrive Monday morning with lumber and purpose. There was no going back now. If you're enjoying Margaret's journey, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next will surprise you even more. Construction began the last week of October, and Margaret Ellis became the town's entertainment. The frame rose around her farmhouse like a giant cage. Vertical posts, horizontal beams, the skeleton taking shape. Neighbors slowed their cars to stare. Some stopped entirely, windows down, openly gawking. Margaret felt their eyes when she brought coffee to the work site, sensed the judgment in every glance. At the general store, Harold Pritchard held court by the stove. "Widow Ellis is building a fortress." Maybe griefs made her paranoid. Laughter followed. Margaret heard about it from 3 people before day's end. Ruth Henley appeared Thursday, picking across construction debris in church shoes. "Dear, people are talking. This looks eccentric." Are you sure you're thinking clearly? Arthur's only been gone 6 months. Margaret set down the 2x4 she'd been positioning. I'm thinking clearly, Ruth. Clearly enough to know I need to heat this house affordably. But darling, this isn't normal. Thank you for your concern. I have work to do. Sunday service was worse. Whispers followed Margaret to her pew, the same pew she and Arthur had occupied for 29 years. The Hendersons turned to look. The Pratts murmured. Even Pastor Williams seemed uncertain, his handshake perfunctory. The teenage Collins boys drove past that night. "Crazy barn lady!" they shouted, laughing as they accelerated. Margaret watched their taillights disappear, something heavy settling in her chest. She was becoming isolated. People who'd brought casseroles after Arthur's funeral now crossed the street to avoid her. Former colleagues cut conversations short. She was different now. Eccentric. Possibly unstable. At night, Margaret sat surrounded by library books. Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, never mentioned Margaret's project, but books on Scandinavian building techniques kept appearing on her study table, marked with subtle bookmarks. A silent ally. Jack faced his own battles. His father called on Tuesday, voice loud enough for Margaret to hear across the yard. "You're building what for who? A barn around some widow's house? This is why you'll never make it in construction. Get serious or come home." Jack's jaw tightened. "I am serious, Dad. This is smart building. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's wrong." He hung up and went back to work, but Margaret saw how his hands shook as he picked up his hammer. Then Harold escalated. The notice arrived November 3rd. Complaint filed with the zoning board. Structure doesn't match town character. Possible fire hazard. Margaret was required to appear at a hearing. The town hall meeting room was packed. Margaret stood at the front with her folder of calculations, feeling like a defendant at trial. Harold presented his case with theatrical concern. "This structure is unprecedented, potentially dangerous, and frankly, a sign Mrs. Ellis needs help, not a building permit." Margaret's voice shook at first, then steadied. She presented heat loss calculations, moisture control diagrams, fire safety data showing the outer shell actually protected against ember strikes. She spoke clearly, methodically, letting facts defend themselves. The board deliberated 10 minutes. Construction could continue, but she was on notice. One safety violation, they'd shut it down. Walking out, Harold muttered loud enough for her to hear. "This is what happens when women try to play builder." Margaret sat in her car afterward, gripping the steering wheel. She'd won. So why did she feel defeated? Rebecca called that night. "Mom, I heard about the hearing. Come stay with me. You don't have to prove anything." Margaret looked around the kitchen, Arthur's mug on the shelf, his jacket on the hook. "Yes, I do." "Prove what? To who?" "I don't know anymore." The admission hurt. "But I'm not stopping now." The first major snowstorm hit mid-November, 10 inches overnight. Margaret woke to a world transformed into hushed white silence. The outer structure was 80% complete, walls enclosed, most roof sections in place. Only the final northern overhang remained. Jack called at 6:30. "We should finish that roof today. You up for working in this?" Margaret looked at the snow falling steadily. 2 months ago, she would have said no, deferred to the expert, stayed inside where it was warm and appropriate. Instead, she pulled on Arthur's old work boots. "I'll put coffee on." They worked through the morning, hands numb despite gloves, breath clouding. Margaret handed up boards while Jack nailed them into place, both dusted white with snow. When the final piece locked in, Margaret felt something shift in her chest. The firewood stacked in the protected gap sat completely dry. She could see it through the outer wall spaces, neat rows, untouched by snow that had buried everything else. Across the road, the Hendersons' pile under its tarp had disappeared beneath white. That evening, Margaret lit her first fire. The bone-dry oak ignited immediately, flames leaping bright and clean. No hissing, no smoke, just pure, efficient heat radiating through the living room. She stood warming her hands, whispering to the empty house, "It's working. It's actually working." 2 houses down, Harold Pritchard had a different experience. Margaret heard about it at the post office. His first fire hissed and smoked, barely producing heat. He'd burned half a dozen logs trying to warm his living room. His wood, stored under a leaking shed, had absorbed moisture all autumn. Now, with temperatures dropping and snow adding dampness, each log was like burning a wet sponge. The radio confirmed predictions. Coldest November in 40 years. The oil company announced a 15% price increase. Firewood suppliers sold out before Thanksgiving. Families whose supplies had rotted found nothing to buy at any price. Margaret discovered she enjoyed the physical labor, the ache in her shoulders from stacking wood, the satisfaction of measuring and cutting, tangible daily progress. Jack had stopped calling her Mrs. Ellis after she'd climbed a ladder in the snow without hesitation. One afternoon, after she'd helped wrestle a warped board into place, he grinned. "You know, you're pretty badass." She laughed. Actually laughed. For the first time in months. The crack came on a gray Tuesday. Martha Pritchard appeared alone, no Harold in sight. She asked to see the structure. They walked around together, Martha examining the design, running her hand along the boards, peering at the protected firewood. Finally, "Harold says this is foolishness." A pause. "But our shed roof leaked. Our wood's wet. Every fire's a battle. How much would it cost to build something like this?" Margaret stared, momentarily speechless. I don't know. I could ask Jack." Martha glanced toward the road, checking for witnesses. "Don't tell Harold I asked." Then she was gone. Margaret stood in the snow, watching her drive away, something warm blooming in her chest. The first crack. Someone believed her. Thanksgiving arrived with Rebecca driving up from Burlington. Margaret led her through the completed structure, watching her daughter's face transform with wonder. "Mom, this is incredible. You built this. You." The tears came unexpectedly. Not the grief tears she'd grown accustomed to, but something else entirely. Relief, pride, the overwhelming realization that she'd done something extraordinary. Rebecca hugged her tight. "Dad would be so proud." "I don't know." Margaret's voice cracked. "This wasn't his way." "No," Rebecca said firmly, pulling back to look at her mother. "It's your way, and that's the point." Outside, snow fell softly on the protected house. Inside the sheltered gap, dry firewood waited. And Margaret Ellis, who'd spent 6 months being the town's laughingstock, finally understood what she'd been proving all along. Not that Arthur's way was wrong, but that her way could be right too. If you're enjoying Margaret's journey, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next will surprise you even more. December arrived with a cold snap that made November seem merciful. The temperature plummeted to 20 below and stayed there for a week, the kind of cold that froze windows and made every breath hurt. This was the test. Margaret's routine had become meditative. Each morning, she'd select bone-dry wood from the protected gap. The oak ignited immediately, burned hot and clean, radiating heat with remarkable efficiency. She was using half the firewood she'd budgeted for, keeping the house at 68 degrees while running the oil furnace only as backup. Her December heating bill would be manageable. 2 houses down, Harold was burning through firewood at triple his normal rate, each wet log hissing and smoking, producing a fraction of the heat it should. He'd gone through half his oil tank in 2 weeks, a $500 December bill. Other neighbors reported similar disasters. The Hendersons couldn't get their upstairs above 50 degrees. The Pratts' children had developed persistent coughs. Elderly Mrs. Whitmore was in genuine danger. The town called an emergency meeting 3 days before Christmas. Margaret almost didn't go. She stood in her warm kitchen, considering staying home, avoiding the stairs. But something, maybe the memory of Martha Pritchard's secret visit, maybe her own growing confidence, made her pull on her coat and drive to the town hall. The meeting room was packed and desperate. Families huddled together, worry etched on every face. The oil delivery company representative explained apologetically that they couldn't keep up with demand. Deliveries were running 2 weeks behind. Prices had jumped another 20%. Harold Pritchard stood up, and Margaret saw something she'd never expected to see. Defeat. His voice cracked as he spoke. I don't know what to do. Our wood's useless. The oil's bankrupting us. We can't keep the house warm. He stopped, swallowed hard. I don't know what to do. Around the room, heads nodded. The community was in crisis. Margaret's hands were shaking as she stood. Every eye turned to her. I might be able to help. The room went silent. Harold's face flushed. With respect, Margaret, your little barn experiment. Something inside Margaret snapped. Not into anger, but into clarity. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and firm. The voice of a teacher who'd spent 28 years explaining science to children who thought they already knew the answers. It's not an experiment anymore, Harold. It works. My firewood is dry. My heating bills are manageable. And if you'd stop being too proud to learn from a woman, I could help you. The silence was absolute. Then Mrs. Chun, the librarian, stood from her seat in the back. I've been to Margaret's house. What she's built is extraordinary. We should listen. Slowly, tentatively, others nodded. Margaret took a breath. I can share the design plans. Jack Morrison and I can help coordinate construction for families who need it. No charge for the advice. She looked directly at Harold. But you have to be willing to do things differently, even if it's not how your fathers did it. The meeting ended with a line of people waiting to speak with her. Young families with children. Elderly residents worried about making it through winter. Even the Hendersons, who'd whispered about her in church just a month ago. Margaret walked home through the snow in a daze. She'd arrived expecting ridicule. She was leaving as a resource, a teacher, an expert. The night was brutally cold, but her house, wrapped in its protective shell, stood warm and ready. Inside, she sat at the kitchen table where she'd done the impossible calculations in October, where she'd written the check to Jack with shaking hands, where she'd doubted herself 100 times. For the first time since Arthur died, she felt like herself. Not Arthur's wife, not someone playing a role to meet expectations, not the grieving widow who needed managing. Herself, Margaret Ellis, 52 years old, science teacher, innovator, survivor, and she was just getting started. February 1973. The brutal winter was ending, and Margaret Ellis sat on her porch in weak spring sunlight, watching something she'd never imagined. Harold Pritchard and Jack Morrison framing an outer structure around Harold's farmhouse. Harold wielding a hammer, taking direction from a 25-year-old. Building Margaret's design. 5 families in town had built or were building variations of what Harold now called the Ellis method. The name had appeared at a town meeting in late January, when he'd stood and said something that had clearly cost him. I was wrong, and that's hard for a man my age to say. But facts are facts. Margaret Ellis solved a problem the rest of us were too stubborn to see. Margaret's heating costs for the entire winter, $240. Her neighbors had spent over $800, some more than $1,000. She hadn't run out of firewood once, while families across town had bought green wood at premium prices that barely heated their homes. Ruth Henley hadn't spoken to Margaret since January. Pride wouldn't let Arthur's sister admit she'd been wrong about the grief-stricken widow needing managing. That was fine. Margaret had stopped needing Ruth's approval somewhere between the zoning hearing and the December cold snap. She'd stopped needing anyone's approval. The spring workshop had been Mrs. Chen's idea. Energy-efficient home design, held at the library every Thursday evening, drew 23 participants. Margaret taught with the same clarity she'd brought to elementary science, explaining thermal envelopes and moisture control, watching faces light up with understanding. The letter from Mother Earth News arrived mid-February. They wanted to feature her story in their summer issue, complete with photographs and detailed plans. Margaret read it 3 times before it felt real. But the most significant change was Arthur's study. Margaret spent a weekend in January redecorating, removing his books to the living room, clearing his desk, painting the walls soft cream instead of dark green. She installed a drafting table by the window and created a workspace that was entirely, unapologetically hers. The first time she sat at that drafting table, she'd cried. Not from grief, though the grief was still there, woven into her daily life. She'd cried from the strange, overwhelming relief of finally having space to be herself. Jack Morrison had more clients than he could handle. His father had called in late January, with an apology and a request to learn the technique. I may have been wrong about the hippie nonsense. Jack and Margaret had formed an unlikely friendship. She brought scientific rigor, he brought innovative design. One evening he'd said something that stayed with her. "You were always this person, the innovator. You just never had space to show it." She'd realized he was right. Harold's transformation was perhaps most remarkable. He and Martha had become regular visitors, Martha and Margaret developing genuine friendship. Harold still wasn't entirely comfortable taking instruction from a woman. Some habits were too deeply ingrained, but he was trying. The whispers at the general store had changed. That Ellis woman figured out something special. The admiration wasn't universal, but even skeptics couldn't argue with warm houses and affordable heating bills. Spring thaw revealed visual proof. Protected houses stood in perfect condition. No ice damage, no rot. Unprotected houses showed winter's toll. Compromised structures, water damage, deterioration that would cost hundreds to repair. Rebecca arrived in March for Margaret's 53rd birthday, carrying a chocolate cake and a card she'd made herself. They walked through the structure together, Rebecca running her hand along the boards. "Are you happy, Mom?" Margaret considered the question carefully, giving it the honesty it deserved. "I miss your father every day. The grief hasn't gone away. But yes, I'm happy. For the first time in my life, I'm happy being exactly who I am." "Who are you?" Margaret smiled. A real smile, full and genuine. "Still figuring that out. But she's someone I like." Later, alone in her workshop, Margaret sat at her drafting table working on plans for a young couple in the next town. Through the window, she could see her house standing strong, wrapped in its protective shell. The firewood storage was half full with seasoned wood for next winter. She picked up the phone to call Jack, then paused, looking around the room that had become hers. Arthur's photograph still sat on the bookshelf. She hadn't removed it, didn't want to, but it was accompanied now by her teaching certificate, the Mother Earth newsletter, a framed photo of her and Rebecca in front of the completed structure. The old and the new existing together. Grief and joy, loss and discovery, all woven into the same life. Outside, the ice melted. Spring was coming, and Margaret Ellis, widow, mother, former teacher, and now pioneer of practical innovation, was just getting started. Thank you for watching. Please support future videos by liking and subscribing to the channel. There's another video similar to this one on your left screen.